High Rise. Written by J.G. Ballard. Narrated by Eric Eve Garcia.
Chapter 1. Critical Mass. Later, as he sat on his balcony eating the dog, Dr. Robert Lang reflected on the unusual events that had taken place within this huge apartment building during the previous 3 months. Now that everything had returned to normal, he was surprised that there had been no obvious beginning, no point beyond which their lives had moved into a clearly more sinister dimension. With its 40 floors and 1,000 apartments, its supermarket and swimming pools, bank and junior school, all in effect abandoned in the sky, the high-rise offered more than enough opportunities for violence and confrontation. Certainly his own studio apartment on the 25th floor was the last place Lang would have chosen as an early skirmish ground. This overpriced cell, slotted almost at random into the cliff face of the apartment building, he had bought after his divorce specifically for its peace, quiet, and anonymity. Curiously enough, despite all Lang's efforts to detach himself from his 2,000 neighbors and the regime of trivial disputes and irritations that provided their only corporate life, it was here, if anywhere, that the first significant event had taken place. On this balcony, where he now squatted beside a fire of telephone directories, eating the roast hindquarter of the Alsatian before setting off to his lecture at the medical school. While preparing breakfast soon after 11 o'clock one Saturday morning 3 months earlier, Dr. Lang was startled by an explosion on the balcony outside his living room. A bottle of sparkling wine had fallen from a floor 50 feet above, ricocheted off an awning as it hurtled downwards, and burst across the tiled balcony floor. The living room carpet was speckled with foam and broken glass. Lang stood in his bare feet among the sharp fragments, watching the agitated wine seethe across the cracked tiles. High above him, on the 31st floor, a party was in progress. He could hear the deliberately over-animated chatter, the aggressive blare of a record player. Presumably the bottle had been knocked over the rail by a boisterous guest. Needless to say, no one at the party was in the least concerned about the ultimate destination of this missile. But as Lang had already discovered, people in high-rises tended not to care about tenants more than 2 floors below them. Trying to identify the apartment, Lang stepped across the spreading pool of cold froth. Sitting there, he might easily have found himself with the longest hangover in the world. He leaned out over the rail and peered up the face of the building, carefully counting the balconies. As usual, though, the dimensions of the 40-story block made his head reel. Lowering his eyes to the tiled floor, he steadied himself against the door pillar. The immense volume of open space that separated the building from the neighboring high-rise a quarter of a mile away unsettled his sense of balance. At times, he felt that he was living in the gondola of a Ferris wheel, permanently suspended 300 feet above the ground. Nonetheless, Lang was still exhilarated by the high-rise, one of 5 identical units in the development project, and the first to be completed and occupied. Together, they were set in a mile-square area of abandoned dockland and warehousing along the north bank of the river. The 5 high-rises stood on the eastern perimeter of the river, looking out across an ornamental lake, at present an empty concrete basin surrounded by parking lots and construction equipment. On the opposite shore stood the recently completed concert hall, with Lang's medical school and the new television studios on either side. The massive scale of the glass and concrete architecture and its striking situation on a bend of the river sharply separated the development project from the run-down areas around it, decaying 19th-century terraced houses and empty factories already zoned for reclamation. For all the proximity of the city 2 miles away to the west along the river, the office buildings of central London belonged to a different world, in time as well as space. Their glass curtain walling and telecommunication aerials were obscured by the traffic smog, blurring Lang's memories of the past. 6 months earlier, when he had sold the lease of his Chelsea house and moved to the security of the high-rise, he had traveled forward 50 years in time. Away from crowded streets, traffic holdups, rush-hour journeys on the underground to student supervisions in a shared office in the old teaching hospital. Here, on the other hand, the dimensions of his life were space, light, and the pleasures of a subtle kind of anonymity. The drive to the physiology department of the medical school took him 5 minutes, and apart from this single excursion, Lang's life in the high-rise was as self-contained as the building itself. In effect, the apartment block was a small vertical city, its 2,000 inhabitants boxed up into the sky. The tenants corporately owned the building, which they administered themselves through a resident manager and his staff. For all its size, the high-rise contained an impressive range of services. The entire 10th floor was given over to a wide concourse, as large as an aircraft carrier's flight deck, which contained a supermarket, bank, and hairdressing salon, a swimming pool and gymnasium, a well-stocked liquor store, and a junior school for the few young children in the block. High above Lang, on the 35th floor, was a second, smaller swimming pool, a sauna, and a restaurant. Delighted by this glut of conveniences, Lang made less and less effort to leave the building. He unpacked his record collection and played himself into his new life, sitting on his balcony and gazing across the parking lots and concrete plazas below him. Although the apartment was no higher than the 25th floor, he felt for the first time that he was looking down at the sky rather than up at it. Each day, the towers of central London seemed slightly more distant, the landscape of an abandoned planet receding slowly from his mind. By contrast with the calm and unencumbered geometry of the concert hall and television studios below him, the ragged skyline of the city resembled the disturbed encephalograph of an unresolved mental crisis. The apartment had been expensive. Its studio living room and single bedroom, kitchen, and bathroom dovetailed into each other to minimize space and eliminate internal corridors. To his sister Alice Frobisher, who lived with her publisher husband in a larger apartment 3 floors below, Lang had remarked, "The architect must have spent his formative years in a space capsule. I'm surprised the walls don't curve." At first Lang had found something alienating about the concrete landscape of the project, an architecture designed for war, on the unconscious level if no other. After all the tensions of his divorce, the last thing he wanted to look out on each morning was a row of concrete bunkers. However, Alice soon convinced him of the intangible appeal of life in a luxury high-rise. 7 years older than Lang, she made a shrewd assessment of her brother's needs in the months after his divorce. She stressed the efficiency of the building's services, the total privacy. "You could be alone here, in an empty building. Think of that, Robert," she added illogically. "Besides, it's full of the kind of people you ought to meet." Here she was making a point that had not escaped Lang during his inspection visits. The 2,000 tenants formed a virtually homogeneous collection of well-to-do professional people, lawyers, doctors, tax consultants, senior academics, and advertising executives, along with a smaller group of airline pilots, film industry technicians, and trios of air hostesses sharing apartments. By the usual financial and educational yardsticks, they were probably closer to each other than the members of any conceivable social mix, with the same tastes and attitudes, fads and styles, clearly reflected in the choice of automobiles in the parking lots that surrounded the high-rise, in the elegant but somehow standardized way in which they furnished their apartments, in the selection of sophisticated foods in the supermarket delicatessen, in the tones of their self-confident voices. In short, they constituted the perfect background into which Lang could merge invisibly. His sister's excited vision of Lang alone in an empty building was closer to the truth than she realized. The high-rise was a huge machine designed to serve, not the collective body of tenants, but the individual resident in isolation. Its staff of air-conditioning conduits, elevators, garbage disposal chutes, and electrical switching systems provided a never-failing supply of care and attention that a century earlier would have needed an army of tireless servants. Besides all this, once Lang had been appointed senior lecturer in physiology at the new medical school, the purchase of an apartment nearby made sense. It helped him as well to postpone once again any decision to give up teaching and take up general practice. But as he told himself, he was still waiting for his real patients to appear. Perhaps he would find them here in the high-rise. Rationalizing his doubts over the cost of the apartment, Lang signed a 99-year lease and moved into his 1,000th share of the cliff face. The sounds of the party continued high overhead, magnified by the currents of air that surged erratically around the building. The last of the wine rilled along the balcony gutter, sparkling its way into the already immaculate drains. Lang placed his bare foot on the cold tiles, and with his toes detached a label from its glass fragment. He recognized the wine immediately, a brand of expensive imitation champagne that was sold pre-chilled in the 10th-floor liquor store and was its most popular line. They had been drinking the same wine at Alice's party the previous evening, in its way as confused an affair as the one taking place that moment over his head. Only too keen to relax after demonstrating all afternoon in the physiology laboratories, and with an eye on an attractive fellow guest, Lang had inexplicably found himself in a minor confrontation with his immediate neighbors on the 25th floor, an ambitious young orthodontic surgeon named Steele, and his pushy fashion consultant wife. Halfway through a drunken conversation, Lang had suddenly realized that he had managed to offend them deeply over their shared garbage disposal chute. The two had cornered Lang behind his sister's bar, where Steele fired a series of pointed questions at him, as though seriously disturbed by a patient's irresponsible attitude towards his own mouth. His slim face topped by a center parting, always an indication to Lang of some odd character strain, pressed even closer, and he half expected Steele to ram a metal clamp or a retractor between his teeth. His intense, glamorous wife followed up the attack, in some way challenged by Lang's offhand manner, his detachment from the serious business of living in the high-rise. Lang's fondness for pre-lunch cocktails, his nude sunbathing on the balcony, and his generally raffish air obviously unnerved her. She clearly felt that at the age of 30, Lang should have been working 12 hours a day in a fashionable consultancy, and be in every way as respectably self-aggrandizing as her husband. No doubt she regarded Lang as some kind of internal escapee from the medical profession, with a secret tunnel into a less responsible world. This low-level bickering surprised Lang, but after his arrival at the apartment building he soon recognized the extraordinary number of thinly veiled antagonisms around him. The high-rise had a second life of its own. Talk at Alice's party moved on two levels. Never far below the froth of professional gossip was a hard mantle of personal rivalry. At times he felt that they were all waiting for someone to make a serious mistake. After breakfast, Lang cleared the glass from the balcony. Two of the decorative tiles had been cracked. Mildly irritated, Lang picked up the bottleneck, still with its wired cork and foil in place, and tossed it over the balcony rail. A few seconds later, he heard it shatter among the cars parked below. Pulling himself together, Lang peered cautiously over the ledge. He might easily have knocked in someone's windscreen. Laughing aloud at this aberrant gesture, he looked up at the 31st floor. What were they celebrating at 11:30 in the morning? Lang listened to the noise mount as more guests arrived. Was this a party that had accidentally started? A common complaint in the high-rise, almost an epidemic. All the residents he had met, on hearing that Lang was a physician, at some point brought up their difficulties in sleeping. At parties people discussed their insomnia in the same way that they referred to the other built-in design flaws of the apartment block. In the early hours of the morning, the 2,000 tenants subsided below a silent tide of seconal. Lang had first met Charlotte in the 35th floor swimming pool, where he usually swam, partly to be on his own, and partly to avoid the children who used the 10th floor pool. When he invited her to a meal in the restaurant, she promptly accepted, but as they sat down at the table, she said pointedly, "Look, I only want to talk about myself." Lang had liked that. At noon, when he arrived at Charlotte's apartment, a second guest was already present, a television producer named Richard Wilder. A thick-set, pugnacious man who had once been a professional rugby league player, Wilder lived with his wife and two sons on the second floor of the building. The noisy parties he held with his friends on the lower levels, airline pilots and hostesses sharing apartments, had already put him at the center of various disputes. To some extent, the irregular hours of the tenants on the lower levels had cut them off from their neighbors above. In an unguarded moment, Lang's sister had whispered to him that there was a brothel operating somewhere in the high-rise. The mysterious movements of the air hostesses as they pursued their busy social lives, particularly on the floors above their own, clearly unsettled Alice, as if they in some way interfered with the natural social order of the building, its system of precedences entirely based on floor height. Lang had noticed that he and his fellow tenants were far more tolerant of any noise or nuisance from the floors above than they were from those below them. However, he liked Wilder, with his loud voice and rugby scrum manners. He led a needed dimension of the unfamiliar into the apartment block. His relationship with Charlotte Melville was hard to gauge. His powerful sexual aggression was overlaid by a tremendous restlessness. No wonder his wife, a pale young woman with a postgraduate degree who reviewed children's books for the literary weeklies, seemed permanently exhausted. As Lang stood on the balcony accepting a drink from Charlotte, the noise of the party came down from the bright air, as if the sky itself had been wired for sound. Charlotte pointed to a fragment of glass on Lang's balcony that had escaped his brush. "Are you under attack? I heard something fall." She called to Wilder, who was lounging back in the center of her sofa, examining his heavy legs. "It's those people on the 31st floor." "Which people?" Lang asked. He assumed that she was referring to a specific group, a clique of over-aggressive film actors or tax consultants, or perhaps a freak aggregation of dipsomaniacs. But Charlotte shrugged, vaguely, as if it was unnecessary to be more specific. Clearly some kind of demarcation had taken place in her mind, like his own facile identification of people by the floors on which they lived. "By the way, what are we all celebrating?" he asked as they returned to the living room. "Don't you know?" Wilder gestures at the walls and ceiling. "Full house. We've achieved critical mass." "Richard means that the last apartment has been occupied," Charlotte explained. "Incidentally, the contractors promised us a free party when the 1000th apartment was sold." "I'll be interested to see if they hold it," Wilder remarked. Clearly he enjoyed running down the high-rise. "The elusive Anthony Royal was supposed to provide the booze. You've met him, I think," he said to Lang. "The architect who designed our hanging paradise." We play squash together," Lang rejoined. Aware of the hint of challenge in Wilder's voice, he added, "Once a week. I hardly know the man, but I like him." Wilder sat forward, cradling his heavy head in his fists. Lang noticed that he was continually touching himself, forever inspecting the hair on his massive calves, smelling the backs of his scarred hands, as if he had just discovered his own body. "You're favored to have met him," Wilder said. "I'd like to know why. An isolated character. I ought to resent him, but somehow I feel sorry for the man, hovering over us like some kind of fallen angel." "He has a penthouse apartment," Lang commented. He had no wish to become involved in any tug-of-war over his brief friendship with Royal. He had met this well-to-do architect, a former member of the consortium which had designed the development project, during the final stages of Royal's recovery from a minor car accident. Lang had helped him set up the complex calisthenics machine in the penthouse where Royal spent his time, the focus of a great deal of curiosity and attention. As everyone continually repeated, Royal lived on top of the building, as if in some kind of glamorous shack. "Royal was the first person to move in here," Wilder informed him. "There's something about him I haven't put my finger on, perhaps even a sense of guilt. He hangs around up there as if he's waiting to be found out. I expected him to leave months ago. He has a rich young wife, so why stay on in this glorified tenement?" Before Lang could protest, Wilder pressed on. "I know Charlotte has reservations about life here. The trouble with these places is that they're not designed for children. The only open space turns out to be someone else's car park. By the way, Doctor, I'm planning to do a television documentary about high-rises, a really hard look at the physical and psychological pressures of living in a huge condominium such as this one." "You'll have a lot of material." "Too much, as always. I wonder if Royal would take part. You might ask him, Doctor. As one of the architects of the block and its first tenant, his views would be interesting. Your own, too." As Wilder talked away rapidly, his words overrunning the cigarette smoke coming from his mouth, Lang turned his attention to Charlotte. She was watching Wilder intently, nodding at each of his points. Lang liked her determination to stick up for herself and his small son, her evident sanity, and good sense. His own marriage, to a fellow physician and specialist in tropical medicine, had been a brief but total disaster, a reflection of heaven only knew what needs. With unerring judgment, Lang had involved himself with this highly strung and ambitious young doctor, for whom Lang's refusal to give up teaching, in itself suspicious, and involve himself directly in the political aspects of preventative medicine had provided a limitless opportunity for bickering and confrontation. After only 6 months together, she had suddenly joined an international famine relief organization and left on a 3-year tour. But Lang had made no attempt to follow her. For reasons he could not yet explain, he had been reluctant to give up teaching, and the admittedly doubtful security of being with students who were still almost his own age. Charlotte, he guessed, would understand this. In his mind, Lang projected the possible course of an affair with her. The proximity and distance which the high-rise provided, at the same time that neutral emotional background against which the most intriguing relationships might develop, had begun to interest him for its own sake. For some reason, he found himself drawing back even within this still imaginary encounter, sensing that they were all far more involved with each other than they realized. An almost tangible network of rivalries and intrigues bound them together. As he guessed, even this apparently casual meeting in Charlotte's apartment had been set up to test his attitude to the upper-level residents, who were trying to exclude children from the 35th floor swimming pool. "The terms of our leases guarantee us equal access to all facilities," Charlotte explained. "We've decided to set up a parents' action group." "Doesn't that leave me out?" "We need a doctor on the committee. The pediatric argument would come much more forcefully from you, Robert." "Well, perhaps." Lang hesitated to commit himself. Before he knew it, he would be a character in a highly charged television documentary, or taking part in a sit-in outside the office of the building manager. Reluctant, at this stage, to be snared into an interfloor wrangle, Lang stood up and excused himself. As he left, Charlotte had equipped herself with a checklist of grievances. Sitting beside Wilder, she began to tick off the complaints to be placed before the building manager, like a conscientious teacher preparing the syllabus for the next term. When Lang returned to his apartment, the party on the 31st floor had ended. He stood on his balcony in the silence, enjoying the magnificent play of light across the neighboring block, 400 yards away. The building had just been completed, and by coincidence the first tenants were arriving on the very morning that the last had moved into his own block. A furniture pantechnicon was backing into the entrance to the freight elevator, and the carpets and stereo speakers, dressing tables and bedside lamps would soon be carried up the elevator shaft to form the elements of a private world. Thinking of the rush of pleasure and excitement which the new tenants would feel as they gazed out for the first time from their aerial ledge on the cliff face, Lang contrasted it with the conversation he had just heard between Wilder and Charlotte Melville. However reluctantly, he now had to accept something he had been trying to repress, that the previous 6 months had been a period of continuous bickering among his neighbors, of trivial disputes over the faulty elevators and air conditioning, inexplicable electrical failures, noise, competition for parking space, and, in short, that host of minor defects which the architects were supposed specifically to have designed out of these overpriced apartments. The underlying tensions among the residents were remarkably strong, damped down partly by the civilized tone of the building, and partly by the obvious need to make this huge apartment block a success. Lang remembered a minor but unpleasant incident that had taken place the previous afternoon on the 10th floor shopping concourse. As he waited to cash a check at the bank, an altercation was going on outside the doors of the swimming pool. A group of children, still wet from the water, were backing away from the imposing figure of a cost accountant from the 17th floor. Facing him in this unequal contest was Helen Wilder. Her husband's pugnacity had long since drained any self-confidence from her. Nervously trying to control the children, she listened stoically to the accountant's reprimand, now and then making some weak retort. Leaving the bank counter, Lang walked toward them, past the crowded checkout points of the supermarket and lines of women under the dryers in the hairdressing salon. As he stood beside Mrs. Wilder, waiting until she recognized him, he gathered that the accountant was complaining that her children, not for the first time, had been urinating in the pool. Lang briefly interceded, but the accountant slammed away through the swing doors, confident that he had sufficiently intimidated Mrs. Wilder to drive her brood of children away forever.
"Thanks for taking my side. Richard was supposed to be here."
She picked a damp thread of hair out of her eyes.
"It's becoming impossible. We arranged said hours for the children, but the adults come anyway."
She took Lang's arm and squinted nervously across the crowded concourse.
Do you mind walking me back to the elevator? It must sound rather paranoid, but I'm becoming obsessed with the idea that one day we'll be physically attacked.
She shuddered under her damp towel as she propelled the children forward.
It's almost as if these aren't really the people who live here.
During the afternoon, Lang found himself thinking of this last remark of Helen Wilder's. Absurd though it sounded, the statement had a certain truth. Now and then, his neighbors, the orthodontic surgeon and his wife, stepped onto their balcony and frowned at Lang, as if disapproving of the relaxed way in which he lay back in his reclining chair. Lang tried to visualize their life together, their hobbies, conversation, sexual acts. It was difficult to imagine any kind of domestic reality, as if the Steeles were a pair of secret agents unconvincingly trying to establish a marital role. By contrast, Wilder was real enough, but hardly belonged to the high-rise. Lang lay back on his balcony, watching the dusk fall across the facades of the adjacent blocks. Their size appeared to vary according to the play of light over their surfaces. Sometimes, when he returned home in the evening from the medical school, he was convinced that the high-rise had managed to extend itself during the day. Lifted on its concrete legs, the 40-story block appeared to be even higher, as if a group of off-duty construction workers from the television studios had casually added another floor. The 5 apartment buildings on the eastern perimeter of the Mile Square project together formed a massive palisade that by dusk had already plunged the suburban streets behind them into darkness. The high-rises seemed almost to challenge the sun itself. Anthony Royal and the architects who had designed the complex could not have foreseen the drama of confrontation each morning between these concrete slabs and the rising sun. It was only fitting that the sun first appeared between the legs of the apartment blocks, raising itself over the horizon as if nervous of waking this line of giants. During the morning, from his office on the top floor of the medical school, Lang would watch their shadows swing across the parking lots and empty plazas of the project's sluice gates opening to admit the day. For all his reservations, Lang was the first to concede that these huge buildings had won their attempt to colonize the sky. Soon after 9 o'clock that evening, an electrical failure temporarily blacked out the 9th, 10th, and 11th floors. Looking back on this episode, Lang was surprised by the degree of confusion during the 15 minutes of the blackout. Some 200 people were present on the 10th floor concourse, and many were injured in the stampede for the elevators and staircases. A number of absurd but unpleasant altercations broke out in the darkness between those who wanted to descend to their apartments on the lower levels and the residents from the upper floors who insisted on escaping upwards into the cooler heights of the building. During the blackout, 2 of the 20 elevators were put out of action. The air conditioning had been switched off, and a woman passenger trapped in an elevator between the 10th and 11th floors became hysterical, possibly the victim of a minor sexual assault. The restoration of light in due course revealed its crop of illicit liaisons flourishing in the benevolent conditions of total darkness like a voracious plant species. Lang was on his way to the gymnasium when the power failed. Uneager to join the melee on the concourse, he waited in the deserted classroom of the junior school. Sitting alone at one of the children's miniature desks, surrounded by the dim outlines of their good-humored drawings pinned to the walls, he listened to their parents scuffling and shouting in the elevator lobby. When the lights returned, he walked out among the startled residents and did his best to calm everyone down. He supervised the transfer of the hysterical woman passenger from the elevator to a lobby sofa, the heavy-boned wife of a jeweler on the 40th floor. She clung powerfully to Lang's arm, only releasing him when her husband appeared. As the crowd of residents dispersed, their fingers punching the elevator destination buttons, Lang noticed that 2 children had sheltered during the blackout in another of the classrooms. They were standing now in the entrance to the swimming pool, backing away defensively from the tall figure of the 17th floor cost accountant. This self-appointed guardian of the water held a long-handled pool skimmer like a bizarre weapon. Angrily, Lang ran forward. But the children were not being driven from the pool. They stepped aside when Lang approached. The accountant stood by the water's edge, awkwardly reaching the skimmer across the calm surface. At the deep end, 3 swimmers, who had been treading water during the entire blackout, were clambering over the side. One of them, he noticed without thinking, was Richard Wilder. Lang took the handle of the skimmer. As the children watched, he helped the accountant extend it across the water. Floating in the center of the pool was the drowned body of an Afghan hound. Chapter 2. Party Time. During these days after the drowning of the dog, the air of overexcitement within the high-rise gradually settled itself, but to Dr. Lang this comparative calm was all the more ominous. The swimming pool on the 10th floor remained deserted, partly, Lang assumed, because everyone felt that the water was contaminated by the dead Afghan. An almost palpable miasma hung over the slack water, as if the spirit of the drowned beast was gathering to itself all the forces of revenge and retribution present within the building. On his way to the medical school a few mornings after the incident, Lang looked in at the 10th floor concourse. After booking a squash court for his weekly game that evening with Anthony Royal, he walked towards the entrance of the swimming pool. He remembered the panic and stampede during the blackout. By contrast, the shopping mall was now almost empty, a single customer ordering his wines at the liquor store. Lang pushed back the swing doors and strolled around the pool. The changing cubicles were closed, the curtains drawn across the shower stalls. The official attendant, a retired physical training instructor, was absent from his booth behind the diving boards. Evidently, the profanation of his water had been too much for him. Lang stood by the tiled verge at the deep end, under the unvarying fluorescent light. Now and then, the slight lateral movement of the building in the surrounding airstream sent a warning ripple across the flat surface of the water, as if in its pelagic deeps an immense creature was stirring in its sleep. He remembered helping the accountant to lift the Afghan from the water, and being surprised by its lightness. With its glamorous plumage drenched by the chlorinated water, the dog had lain like a large stoat on the colored tiles. While they waited for the owner, a television actress from the 37th floor, to come down and collect the dog, Lang examined it carefully. There were no external wounds or marks of restraint. Conceivably, it had strayed from its apartment into a passing elevator and emerged onto the shopping concourse during the confusion of the power failure, fallen into the swimming pool, and died there of exhaustion. But the explanation hardly fitted the facts. The blackout had lasted little more than 15 minutes, and a dog of this size was powerful enough to swim for hours. Besides, it could simply have stood on its hind legs in the shallow end. But if it had been thrown into the pool, and held below the water in the darkness by a strong swimmer. Surprised by his own suspicions, Lang made a second circuit of the pool. Something convinced him that the dog's drowning had been a provocative act, intended to invite further retaliation in its turn. The presence of the 50 or so dogs in the high-rise had long been a source of irritation. Almost all of them were owned by residents of the top 10 floors, just as, conversely, most of the 50 children lived in the lower 10. Together, the dogs formed a set of over-pampered pedigree pets whose owners were not noticeably concerned for their fellow tenants' comfort and privacy. The dogs barked around the car parks when they were walked in the evening, fouling the pathways between the cars. On more than one occasion, elevator doors were sprayed with urine. Lang had heard Helen Wilder complain that, rather than use their 5 high-speed elevators which carried them from a separate entrance lobby directly to the top floors, the dog owners habitually transferred to the lower-level elevators, encouraging their pets to use them as lavatories. This rivalry between the dog owners and the parents of small children had, in a sense, already polarized the building. Between the upper and lower floors, the central mass of apartments, roughly from the 10th floor to the 30th, formed a buffer state. During the brief interregnum after the dog's drowning, a kind of knowing calm presided over the middle section of the high-rise, as if the residents had already realized what was taking place within the building. Lang discovered this when he returned that evening from the medical school. By 6 o'clock, the section of the parking lot reserved for the 20th to the 25th floors would usually be full, forcing him to leave his car in the visitors section 300 yards from the building. Reasonably enough, the architects had zoned the parking lots so that the higher a resident's apartment, and consequently the longer the journey by elevator, the nearer he parked to the building. The residents from the lower floors had to walk considerable distances to and from their cars each day. A sight not without its satisfaction, Lang had noticed. Somehow the high-rise played into the hands of the most petty impulses. That evening, however, as he reached the already crowded car park, Lang was surprised by his fellow tenant's tolerant behavior. He arrived at the same time as his neighbor, Dr. Steele. By rights, they should have raced each other for the last vacant place and taken separate elevators to their floor. But tonight each beckoned the other forward in a show of exaggerated gallantry, and waited while the other parked. They even walked together to the main entrance. In the lobby, a group of tenants stood outside the manager's office, remonstrating noisily with his secretary. The electrical supply system on the 9th floor was still out of order, and at night the floor was in darkness. Fortunately, it was light until late in the summer evening, but the inconvenience to the 50 residents on the floor was considerable. None of the appliances in their apartments would function, and the limits of cooperation with their neighbors on the floors above and below had soon been reached. Steele watched them unsympathetically. Although he was in his late 20s, his manner was already securely middle-aged. Lang found himself fascinated by his immaculate center parting, almost an orifice. "They're always complaining about something," Steele confided to Lang as they stepped into an elevator. "If it isn't this, it's that. They seem unwilling to accept that the services in the new building take time to settle down. Still, it must be a nuisance to have no power." Steele shook his head. "They persistently overload the master fuses with their elaborate stereo systems and unnecessary appliances. Electronic baby minders because the mothers are too lazy to get out of their easy chairs. Special mashers for their children's food." Lang waited for the journey to end, already regretting his newfound solidarity with his neighbor. For some reason, Steele made him nervous. Not for the first time, he wished he had purchased an apartment above the 30th floor. The high-speed elevators were bliss. "The children here look well enough to me," he remarked when they stepped out of the 25th floor. The surgeon held his elbow in a surprisingly powerful grip. He smiled reassuringly, flashing a mouth like a miniature cathedral of polished ivory. "Believe me, Lang, I see their teeth." The punitive tone in Steele's voice, as if he were describing a traditionally feckless band of migrant workers rather than his well-to-do neighbors, came as a surprise to Lang. He knew casually a few of the 9th-floor residents, a sociologist who was a friend of Charlotte Melville's, and an air traffic controller who played string trios with friends on the 25th floor, an amusing and refined man to whom Lang often talked as he carried his cello into the elevator. But distance lent disenchantment. The extent of this separation of loyalties was brought home to Lang when he set off to play squash with Anthony Royal. He took an elevator up to the 40th floor and, as usual, arrived 10 minutes early so that he could go out onto the roof. The spectacular view always made Lang aware of his ambivalent feelings for this concrete landscape. Part of its appeal lay all too clearly in the fact that this was an environment built, not for man, but for man's absence. Lang leaned against the parapet, shivering pleasantly in his sports clothes. He shielded his eyes from the strong air currents that rose off the face of the high-rise. The cluster of auditorium roofs, curving roadway embankments, and rectilinear curtain walling formed an intriguing medley of geometries, less a habitable architecture, he reflected, than the unconscious diagram of a mysterious psychic event. 50 feet away to Lang's left, a cocktail party was in progress. 2 buffet tables covered with white cloths had been laid with trays of canapes and glasses, and a waiter was serving drinks behind a portable bar. Some 30 guests in evening dress stood about talking in small groups. For a few minutes Lang ignored them, absent-mindedly tapping his rackets case on the parapet, but something about the hard, over-animated chatter made him turn. Several of the guests were looking in his direction, and Lang was certain that they were talking about him. The party had moved nearer, and the closest guests were no more than 10 feet away. All were residents from the top 3 floors. Even more unusual was the self-conscious formality of their dress. At none of the parties in the high-rise had Lang seen anyone dressed in anything other than casual wear, yet here the men wore dinner jackets and black ties, the women floor-length evening dresses. They carried themselves in a purposeful way, as if this were less a party than a planning conference. Almost within arm's reach, the immaculate figure of a well-to-do art dealer was squaring up to Lang, the lapels of his dinner jacket flexing like an overworked bellows. On either side of him were the middle-aged wives of a stock exchange jobber and a society photographer, staring distastefully at Lang's white sport clothes and sneakers. Lang picked up his rackets case and towel bag, but his way to the staircase was blocked by the people around him. The entire cocktail party had moved along the roof, and the waiter now stood alone between the bar and the buffet tables. Lang leaned against the parapet, for the first time conscious of the immense distance to the ground below. He was encircled by a heavily breathing group of his fellow residents, so close that he could smell the medley of expensive scents and aftershaves. He was curious as to what exactly they were going to do, but at the same time was aware that at any moment a meaningless act of violence might occur. "Dr. Lang? Ladies, would you release the doctor?" At what seemed the last moment, a familiar figure with adroit hands and a soft walk called out reassuringly. Lang recognized the jeweler whose hysterical wife he had briefly examined during the power failure. As he greeted Lang, the guests casually dispersed, like a group of extras switched to another scene. Without thinking, they strolled back to their drinks and canopies. "Was it fortunate that I arrived?" The jeweler peered at Lang, as if puzzled by his presence in this private domain. "You're here to play squash with Anthony Royal. I'm afraid he's decided to decline," he added, as much to himself as to Lang. "My wife should have been here. She was treated appallingly, you know. They were like animals." Slightly shaken, Lang accompanied him to the stairway. He looked back at the cocktail party with its well-bred guests, uncertain whether he had imagined the imminent attack on him. After all, what could they have actually done? Hardly tossed him over the edge. As he pondered this, he noticed a familiar pale-haired figure in a white safari jacket standing with one hand on the calisthenics machine in the penthouse overlooking the northern end of the roof. Resting at his feet was Royal's Alsatian, with its Arctic coat, without doubt the premier dog in the high-rise. Making no attempt to hide himself, Anthony Royal was watching Lang with a thoughtful gaze. As always, his expression was an uneasy mixture of arrogance and defensiveness, as if he were all too aware of the built-in flaws of this huge building he had helped design, but was determined to outstare any criticism, even at the price of theatrical gestures such as the Alsatian and his white hunter's jacket. Although he was over 50, his shoulder-length fair hair made him look uncannily youthful, as if the cooler air at these great heights had somehow preserved him from the ordinary processes of aging. His bony forehead, still marked by the scars of his accident, was tilted to one side, and he seemed to be checking that an experiment he had set up had now been concluded. Lang raised one hand and signaled to him as the jeweler ushered him briskly below. But Royal made no reply. Why had he not cancelled the squash game by telephone? For a moment, Lang was certain that Royal had deliberately let him come up to the roof, knowing that the party was in progress, simply out of interest in the guests' reactions and behavior. The next morning, Lang rose early, eager to get on. He felt fresh and clear-headed, and without realizing why, he decided to take the day off. Promptly at 9, after pacing about for 2 hours, he telephoned his secretary at the medical school and postponed that afternoon's supervision. When she expressed regret at Lang's illness, he brushed this aside. "It's all right. I'm not ill. Something important has come up." What? Puzzled by his own behavior, Lang wandered around the small apartment. Charlotte Melville was also at home. She was dressed for the office in a formal business suit, but made no attempt to leave. She invited Lang over for coffee, but when he arrived an hour later, she absent-mindedly handed him a glass of sherry. His visit, Lang soon discovered, was a pretext for him to examine her son. The boy was playing in his room, but according to Charlotte was not feeling well enough to go to the junior school on the 10th floor. Annoyingly, the young sister of an airline pilot's wife on the first floor had declined to babysit. "It's a nuisance. She's usually only too keen. I've relied on her for months." She sounded rather vague on the phone, as if she was being evasive. Lang listened sympathetically, wondering whether he should volunteer to look after the child, But there was no hint of this in Charlotte's voice. Playing with the boy, Lang realized that there was nothing wrong with him. Lively as ever, he asked his mother if he could go to his third-floor playgroup that afternoon. Without thinking, she refused. Lang watched her with growing interest. Like himself, Charlotte was waiting for something to happen. They did not have long to wait. In the early afternoon, the first of a fresh series of provocations took place between the rival floors, setting in motion again the dormant machinery of disruption and hostility. The incidents were trivial enough, but Lang knew already that they reflected deep-rooted antagonisms that were breaking through the surface of life within the high-rise at more and more points. Many of the factors involved had long been obvious. Complaints about noise and the abuse of the building's facilities, rivalries over the better-suited apartments, those away from the elevator lobbies and the service shafts with their eternal rumbling. There was even a certain petty envy of the more attractive women who were supposed to inhabit the upper floors, a widely held belief that Lang had enjoyed testing. During the electricity blackout, the 18-year-old wife of a fashion photographer on the 38th floor had been assaulted in the hairdressing salon by an unknown woman. Presumably in retaliation, 3 air hostesses from the second floor were aggressively jostled by a party of marauding top-floor matrons led by the strong-shouldered wife of the jeweler. Watching from Charlotte's balcony, Lang waited as the first of these incidents took place. Standing there with a pretty woman, a drink in one hand, he felt pleasantly lightheaded. Below them on the 9th floor, a children's party was in full swing. The parents made no attempt to restrain their offspring, in effect urging them to make as much noise as possible. Within half an hour, fueled by a constant flow of alcohol, the parents took over from their children. Charlotte laughed openly as soft drinks were poured onto the cars below, drenching the windscreens and roofs of the expensive limousines and sports saloons in the front ranks. These lively proceedings were watched by hundreds of residents who had come out onto their balconies. Playing up to their audience, the parents egged on their children. The party was soon out of control. Drunken children tottered about helplessly. High above them, on the 37th floor, a woman barrister began to shout angrily, outraged by the damage to her open-topped sports car, whose black leather seats were covered with melting ice cream. A pleasant carnival atmosphere reigned. At least it made a change, Lang felt, from the formal behavior of the high-rise. Despite themselves, he and Charlotte joined in the laughter and applause as if they were spectators at an impromptu amateur circus. A remarkable number of parties were being held that evening. Usually, few parties took place other than at weekends, but on this Wednesday evening everyone was involved in one revel or another. Telephones rang continuously, and Charlotte and Lang were invited to no less than 6 separate parties. "I ought to get my hair done." Charlotte took his arm happily, almost embracing Lang. "What exactly are we celebrating?" The question surprised Lang. He held Charlotte's shoulder, as if protecting her. God only knows. Nothing to do with fun and games. One of the invitations had come from Richard Wilder. Instantly, both he and Charlotte had declined. "Why did we refuse?" Charlotte asked, her hand still on the receiver. "He was expecting us to say no." "The Wilders live on the 2nd floor," Lang explained. "Things are rather rowdy down there." "Robert, that's a rationalization." Behind Charlotte, as she spoke, her television set was showing the newsreel of an attempted prison breakout. The sound had been turned down, and the silent images of crouching warders and police and the tiers of barricaded cells flickered between her legs. Everyone in the high-rise, Lang reflected, watched television with the sound down. The same images glowed through his neighbors' doorways when he returned to his apartment. For the first time, people were leaving their front doors ajar and moving casually in and out of each other's apartments. However, these intimacies did not extend beyond each resident's immediate floor. Elsewhere, the polarization of the building proceeded apace. Finding that he had run out of liquor, Lang took the elevator down to the 10th floor concourse. As he expected, there was a heavy run on alcohol, and long lines of impatient residents stood outside the liquor store. Seeing his sister Alice near the counter, Lang tried to enlist her help. Without hesitating, she turned him down and promptly launched into a vigorous denunciation of the tomfoolery that afternoon. In some way, she clearly associated Lang with the lower-floor tenants responsible, identifying him with Richard Wilder and his rowdies. As Lang waited to be served, what resembled a punitive expedition from the upper floors caused a fracas in the swimming pool. A party of residents from the top 3 floors arrived in a belligerent mood. Among them was the actress whose Afghan hound had drowned in the pool. She and her companions began fooling about in the water, drinking champagne on a rubber raft against the swimming pool rules and splashing people leaving the changing cubicles. After a futile attempt to intercede, the elderly attendant gave up and retreated to his booth behind the diving boards. The elevators were full of aggressive pushing and heaving. The signal buttons behaved erratically, and the elevator shafts drummed as people pounded impatiently on the doors. On their way to a party on the 27th floor, Lang and Charlotte were jostled when the elevator was carried down to the 3rd floor by a trio of drunken pilots. Bottles in hand, they had been trying for half an hour to reach the 10th floor. Seizing Charlotte good-humoredly around the waist, one of the pilots almost dragged her off to the small projection theater beside the school, which had previously been used for showing children's films. The theater was now screening a private program of blue movies, including one apparently made on the premises with locally recruited performers. At the party on the 27th floor, given by Adrian Talbot, an effeminate but likable psychiatrist at the medical school, Lang began to relax for the first time that day. He noticed immediately that all the guests were drawn from the apartments nearby. Their faces and voices were reassuringly familiar. In a sense, as he remarked to Talbot, they constituted the members of a village. "Perhaps a clan would be more exact," Talbot commented. "The population of this apartment block is nowhere so homogeneous as it looks at first sight. We'll soon be refusing to speak to anyone outside our own enclave," he added. "My car had its windscreen smashed this afternoon by a falling bottle. Could I move it back to where you people are?" As a qualified physician, Talbot was entitled to park in the ranks closest to the building. Lang, perhaps anticipating the dangers of proximity, had never made use of this concession. The psychiatrist's request was instantly granted by his fellow residents, an appeal to solidarity that no member of his clan could deny. The party was one of the most successful Lang had attended. Unlike the majority of parties in the high-rise, at which well-bred guests stood about exchanging professional small talk before excusing themselves, this one had real buoyancy, an atmosphere of true excitement. Within half an hour, almost all the women were drunk, a yardstick Lang had long used to measure the success of a party. When he complimented Talbot, the psychiatrist was noncommittal. "There's a quickening pulse in the air, all right, but has it anything to do with good humor or fellow feeling? Rather the opposite, I'd guess." "You're not concerned?" "For some reason, less than I should be. But that's true of us all." These agreeably expressed remarks cautioned Lang. Listening to the animated conversations around him, he was struck by the full extent of the antagonism being expressed, the hostility directed at people who lived in other sections of the high-rise, the malicious humor, the eagerness to believe any piece of gossip, and any tall story about the shiftlessness of the lower-floor tenants, or the arrogance of the upper floor, had all the intensity of racial prejudice. But as Talbot had pointed out, Lang found himself unworried by all this. He even took a certain crude pleasure in joining in the gossip, and in watching the usually circumspect Charlotte Melville put down several more than 2 drinks too many. At least it was a means by which they could reach each other. However, as the party broke up, a small but unpleasant episode took place outside the elevator doors in the 27th floor lobby. Although it was after 10 o'clock, the entire building was alive with noise. Residents were barging in and out of each other's apartments, shouting down the staircases like children refusing to go to bed. Confused by the endless button punching, the elevators had come to a halt, and gangs of impatient passengers packed the lobbies. Although their next destination, a party given by a lexicographer on the 26th floor, was only 1 story below them, everyone leaving Talbot's party was determined not to use the stairs. Even Charlotte, face flushed and tottering happily on Lang's arm, joined in the wild surge across the elevator lobby and drummed on the doors with her strong fists. When at last an elevator arrived, the doors opened to reveal a solitary passenger, a thin-shouldered and neurasthenic young masseuse who lived with her mother on the 5th floor. Lang immediately recognized her as one of the vagrants, of whom there were many in the high-rise. bored apartment-bound housewives and stay-at-home adult daughters who spent a large part of their time riding the elevators and wandering the long corridors of the vast building, migrating endlessly in search of change or excitement. Alarmed by the drunken crowd reeling towards her, the young woman snapped out of her reverie and pressed a button at random. A derisory hoot went up from the swaying guests. Within seconds, she was pulled from the elevator and put through a mock-playful grilling. A statistician's overexcited wife shouted at the hapless girl in a shrill voice, pushed a strong arm through the front rank of the interrogators, and slapped her face. Pulling himself away from Charlotte, Lang stepped forward. The crowd's mood was unpleasant but difficult to take seriously. His neighbors were like a group of unrehearsed extras playing a lynch scene. "Come on, I'll see you to the stairs." Holding the young woman by her thin shoulders, he tried to steer her towards the door, but there was a chorus of skeptical shouts. The women among the guests pushed aside their husbands and began to punch the girl on the arms and chest. Giving up, Lang stood to one side. He watched as the shocked young woman stumbled into the mouth of this eager gauntlet and was pummeled through a circuit of fists before she was allowed to disappear into the stairwell. His reflex of chivalry and good sense had been no match for this posse of middle-aged avenging angels. Uneasily, he thought, "Careful, Lang, or some stockbroker's wife will unman you as expertly as she destones a pair of avocados." The night passed noisily, with constant movement through the corridors, the sounds of shouts and breaking glass in the elevator shafts, the blare of music falling across the dark air. Chapter 3. Death of a Resident. A cloudless sky, as dull as the air over a cold vat, lay across the concrete walls and embankments of the development project. At dawn, after a confused night, Lang went out on his balcony and looked down at the silent parking lots below. Half a mile to the south, the river continued on its usual course from the city, but Lang searched the surrounding landscape, expecting it to have changed in some radical way. Wrapped in his bathrobe, he massaged his bruised shoulders. Although he had failed to realize it at the time, there had been a remarkable amount of physical violence during the parties. He touched the tender skin, prodding the musculature as if searching for an other self. The physiologist who had taken a quiet studio in this expensive apartment building 6 months earlier. Everything had started to get out of hand. Disturbed by the continuous noise, he had slept for a little more than an hour. Although the high-rise was silent, the last of the 100 or so separate parties held in the building had ended only 5 minutes beforehand. Far below him, the cars in the front ranks of the parking lot were spattered with broken eggs, wine, and melted ice cream. A dozen windscreens had been knocked out by falling bottles. Even at this early hour, at least 20 of Lang's fellow residents were standing on their balconies, gazing down at the debris gathering at the cliff foot. Unsettled, Lang prepared breakfast, absent-mindedly pouring away most of the coffee he had percolated before he tasted it. With an effort, he reminded himself that he was due to demonstrate in the physiology department that morning. Morning. Already his attention was fixed on the events taking place within the high-rise, as if this huge building existed solely in his mind and would vanish if he stopped thinking about it. Staring at himself in the kitchen mirror, at his wine-stained hands and unshaven face with its surprisingly good color, he tried to switch himself on. For once, Lang, he told himself, fight your way out of your own head. The disturbing image of the posse of middle-aged women beating up the young masseuse anchored everything around him to a different plane of reality. His own reaction, the prompt sidestep out of their way, summed up more than he realized about the progress of events. At 8 o'clock, Lang set off for the medical school. The elevator was filled with broken glass and beer cans. Part of the control panel had been damaged in an obvious attempt to prevent the lower floors signaling the car. As he walked across the parking lot, Lang looked back at the high-rise, aware that he was leaving part of his mind behind him. When he reached the medical school, he walked through the empty corridors of the building, with an effort re-establishing the identity of the offices and lecture theaters. He let himself into the dissecting rooms of the anatomy department and walked down the lines of the glass-topped tables, staring at the partially dissected cadavers. The steady amputation of limbs and thorax, head and abdomen by teams of students, which would reduce each cadaver by term's end to a clutch of bones and a burial tag, exactly matched the erosion of the world around the high-rise. During the day, as Lang took his supervision and lunched with his colleagues in the refectory, he thought continually about the apartment building, a Pandora's box whose 1,000 lids were one by one inwardly opening. The dominant tenants of the high-rise, Lang reflected, those who had adapted most successfully to life there, were not the unruly airline pilots and film technicians from the lower floors, nor the bad-tempered and aggressive wives of the well-to-do tax specialists on the upper floors. Although at first sight these people appeared to provoke all the tension and hostility, those really responsible were the quiet and self-contained residents, like the dental surgeon Steele and his wife. A new social type was being created by the apartment building, a cool, unemotional personality, impervious to the psychological pressures of high-rise life, with minimal needs for privacy, who thrived like an advanced species of machine in the neutral atmosphere. This was the sort of resident who was content to do nothing but sit in his overpriced apartment, watch television with the sound turned down, and wait for his neighbors to make a mistake. Perhaps the recent incidents represented a last attempt by Wilder and the airline pilots to rebel against this unfolding logic. Sadly, they had little chance of success, precisely because their opponents were people who were content with their lives in the high-rise, who felt no particular objection to an impersonal steel and concrete landscape, no qualms about the invasion of their privacy by government agencies and data processing organizations, and if anything welcomed these invisible intrusions, using them for their own purposes. These people were the first to master a new kind of late 20th century life. They thrived on the rapid turnover of acquaintances, the lack of involvement with others, and the total self-sufficiency of lives which, needing nothing, were never disappointed. Alternatively, their real needs might emerge later. The more arid and affectless life became in the high-rise, the greater the possibilities it offered. By its very efficiency, the high-rise took over the task of maintaining the social structure that supported them all. For the first time, it removed the need to repress every kind of antisocial behavior, and left them free to explore any deviant or wayward impulses. It was precisely in these areas that the most important and most interesting aspects of their lives would take place. Secure within the shell of the high-rise, like passengers on board an automatically piloted airliner, they were free to behave in any way they wished, explore the darkest corners they could find. In many ways, the high-rise was a model of all that technology had done to make possible the expression of a truly free psychopathology. During the long afternoon, Lang slept in his office, waiting until he could leave the medical school and return home. When he left, at last, he drove at speed past the half-completed television studios, and then was held up for 5 minutes by a line of bulk cement carriers entering the construction site. It was here that Anthony Royal had been injured when his car had been crushed by a reversing grader. It often struck Lang as ironic, and in a way typical of Royal's ambiguous personality, that he should not only have become the project's first road casualty, but have helped to design the site of the accident. Annoyed by the delay, Lang fretted at the wheel. For some reason, he was convinced that important events were taking place in his absence. Sure enough, when he reached the apartment building at 6 o'clock, he learned that a number of fresh incidents had occurred. After changing, he joined Charlotte Melville for drinks. She had left her advertising agency before lunch, worried about her son. "I didn't like him being on his own here. The babysitters are so unreliable." She poured whiskey into their glasses, gesturing with the decanter in an alarmed way as if about to toss it over the balcony rail. "Robert, what is happening? Everything seems to be in a state of crisis. I'm frightened to step into an elevator by myself." "Charlotte, things aren't that bad," Lang heard himself say. "There's nothing to worry about." Did he really believe that life here was running smoothly? Lang listened to his own voice and noticed how convincing he sounded. The catalogue of disorder and provocation was a long one, even for a single afternoon. 2 successive groups of children from the lower floors had been turned away from the recreation garden on the roof. This walled enclosure fitted with swings, roundabouts, and play sculptures had been specifically intended by Anthony Royal for the amusement of the residents' children. The gates of the garden had now been padlocked, and any children approaching the roof were ordered away. Meanwhile, the wives of several top-floor tenants claimed that they had been abused in the elevators. Other residents, as they left for their offices that morning, had found that their car tires had been slashed. Vandals had broken into classrooms of the junior school on the 10th floor and torn down the children's posters. The lobbies of the 5 lower floors had been mysteriously fouled by dog excrement. The residents had promptly scooped this into an express elevator and delivered it back to the top floor. When Lang laughed at this, Charlotte drummed her fingers on his arm, as if trying to wake him up. "Robert, you ought to take all this seriously." "I do." "You're in a trance." Lang looked down at her, suddenly aware that this intelligent and likable woman was failing to get the point. He placed an arm around her, unsurprised by the fierce way in which she embraced him. Ignoring her small son trying to open the kitchen door, she leaned against it and pulled Lang onto herself, kneading his arms as if trying to convince herself that here at last was something whose shape she could influence. During the hour they waited for her son to fall asleep, her hands never left Lang. But even before they sat down together on her bed, Lang knew that, almost as an illustration of the paradoxical logic of the high-rise, their relationship would end rather than begin with this first sexual act. In a real sense, this would separate them from each other rather than bring them together. By the same paradox, the affection and concern he felt for her as they lay across her small bed seemed callous rather than tender, precisely because these emotions were unconnected with the realities of the world around them. The tokens that they should exchange, which would mark their real care for each other, were made of far more uncertain materials, the erotic and perverse. When she was asleep in the early evening light, Lang let himself out of the apartment and went in search of his new friends. Outside, in the corridors and elevator lobbies, scores of people were standing about. In no hurry to return to his apartment, Lang moved from one group to another, listening to the talk going on. These informal meetings were soon to have an almost official status, forums at which the residents could air their problems and prejudices. Most of their grievances, Lang noticed, were now directed at the other tenants, rather than at the building. The failure of the elevators was blamed on people from the upper and lower floors, not on the architects or the inefficient services designed into the block. The garbage disposal chute Lang shared with the Steeles had jammed again. He tried to telephone the building manager, but the exhausted man had been inundated with complaints and requests for action of every kind. Several members of his staff had resigned, and the energies of the remainder were now devoted to keeping the elevators running and trying to restore power to the 9th floor. Lang mustered what tools he could find and went into the corridor to free the chute himself. Steele immediately came to his aid, bringing with him a complex multi-bladed cutting device. While the two men worked away, trying to loosen a bundle of brocaded curtain that supported a column of trapped kitchen refuse, Steele amiably regaled Lang with a description of those tenants above and below them responsible for overloading the disposal system. "Some of these people generate the most unusual garbage. Certainly the kind of thing we didn't expect to find here," he confided to Lang. "Objects that could well be of interest to the Vice Squad. That beautician on the 33rd floor, the two so-called radiographers living together on the 22nd. Strange young women, even for these days." To some extent, Lang found himself agreeing. However petty the complaints might sound, the 50-year-old owner of the hairdressing salon was endlessly redecorating her apartment on the 33rd floor, and did stuff old rugs and even intact pieces of small furniture into the chute. Steele stood back as the column of garbage sank below in a greasy avalanche. He held Lang's arm, steering him around a beer can lying on the corridor floor. "Still, no doubt we're all equally guilty. I hear that on the lower floors people are leaving small parcels of garbage outside their apartment doors. Now, you'll come in for a drink, My wife is keen to see you again." Despite his memories of their quarrel, Lang had no qualms about accepting. As he expected, in the larger climate of confrontation, any unease between them was soon forgotten. Her hair immaculately coiffured, Mrs. Steele hovered about him with the delighted smile of a novice madam entertaining her first client. She even complimented Lang on his choice of music, which she could hear through the poorly insulated walls. Lang listened to her spirited description of the continuous breakdown of services within the building, the vandalizing of an elevator, and the changing cubicles of the 10th-floor swimming pool. She referred to the high-rise as if it were some kind of huge animate presence, brooding over them and keeping a magisterial eye on the events taking place. There was something in this feeling. The elevators pumping up and down the long shafts resembled pistons in the chamber of a heart. The residents moving along the corridors were the cells in a network of arteries, the lights in their apartments the neurons of a brain. Lang looked out across the darkness at the brilliantly lit decks of the nearby high-rise, barely aware of the other guests who had arrived and were sitting in the chairs around him. The television newsreader Paul Crosland and a film critic named Eleanor Powell, a hard-drinking redhead whom Lang often found riding the elevators up and down in a fuddled attempt to find a way out of the building. Crosland had become the nominal leader of their clan, a local cluster of some 30 contiguous apartments on the 25th, 26th, and 27th floors. Together they were planning a joint shopping expedition on the 10th-floor supermarket the following day, like a band of villagers going on an outing to an unpoliced city. Beside him on the sofa, Eleanor Powell was watching Crosland in a glazed way, while the newsreader, in his florid announcer style, outlined his proposals for the security of their apartments. Now and then she reached forward with one hand, as if trying to adjust Crosland's image, perhaps alter the color values of his fleshy cheeks, or turn down the volume of his voice. "Isn't your apartment next to the elevator lobby?" Lang asked her. "You'll need to barricade yourself in."
"What on earth for? I leave the door wide open."
When Lang looked puzzled, she said,
"Isn't that part of the fun?"
"You think that we're secretly enjoying all this?"
"Don't you? I'd guess so, Doctor. Togetherness is beating up an empty elevator. For the first time since we were 3 years old, what we do makes absolutely no difference. When you think about it, that's really rather interesting."
When she leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder, Lang said, "Something seems to be wrong with the air conditioning. There should be some fresh air on the balcony." Holding his arm, she picked up her bag.
"All right, lift me up. You're a shy lecher, Doctor."
They had reached the French windows when there was an explosion of breaking glass from a balcony high above them. Fragments of glass flicked away like knives through the night air. A large, ungainly object whirled past, no more than 20 feet from the balcony. Startled, Eleanor blundered into Lang. As they caught their balance, there was the sound of a harsh metallic collision from the ground below, almost as if a car had crashed. A short but unbroken silence followed, the first true quiet Lang realized that the building had known for days. Everyone crowded onto the balcony, Crosland and Steele grappling together as if each was trying to prevent the other from jumping over the ledge. Pushed along the railing, Lang saw his own empty balcony 15 feet away. In an absurd moment of panic, he wondered if he himself was the victim. All around, people were leaning on their railings, glasses in hand, staring down through the darkness. Far below, embedded in the crushed roof of a car in the front rank, was the body of a man in evening dress. Eleanor Powell, her face like pain, swayed from the rail and pushed away past Crosland. Lang held tightly to the metal bar, shocked and excited at the same time. Almost every balcony on the huge face of the high-rise was now occupied, the residents gazing down as if from their boxes in an enormous outdoor opera house. No one approached the crushed car, or the body embedded in its roof. Seeing the burst tuxedo and the small patent leather shoes, Lang thought that he recognized the dead man as the jeweler from the 40th floor. His pebble spectacles lay on the ground by the front wheel of the car, their intact lenses reflecting the brilliant lights of the apartment building. Chapter 4. Up. During the week after the jeweler's death, events moved rapidly in a more disquieting direction. Richard Wilder, 24 floors below Dr. Lang, and for that reason far more exposed to the pressures generated within the building, was among the first to realize the full extent of the changes taking place. Wilder had been away on location for 3 days, shooting scenes for a new documentary on prison unrest. A strike by the inmates at a large provincial prison, widely covered by the newspapers and television, had given him a chance to inject some directly topical footage into the documentary. He returned home in the early afternoon. He had telephoned Helen each evening from his hotel and questioned her carefully about conditions in the high-rise, but she made no particular complaints. Nevertheless, her vague tone concerned him. When he had parked, Wilder kicked open the door and lifted his heavy body from behind the steering wheel. From his place on the perimeter of the parking lot, he carefully scanned the face of the huge building. At first glance, everything had settled down. The hundreds of cars were parked in orderly lines. The tiers of balconies rose through the clear sunlight, potted plants thriving behind the railings. For a moment, Wilder felt a pang of regret. Always a believer in direct action, he had enjoyed the skirmishes of the past week, roughing up his aggressive neighbors, particularly those residents from the top floors who had made life difficult for Helen and the two boys. The one discordant note was provided by the fractured picture window on the 40th floor, through which the unfortunate jeweler had made his exit. At either end of the floor were two penthouse apartments, the north corner occupied by Anthony Royal, the other by the jeweler and his wife. The broken pane had not been replaced, and the asterisk of cracked glass reminded Wilder of some kind of cryptic notation, a transfer on the fuselage of a wartime aircraft marking a kill. Wilder unloaded his suitcase from the car and a hold-all containing presents for Helen and his sons. On the rear seat was a lightweight cinecamera with which he planned to shoot a few hundred feet of pilot footage for his documentary on the high-rise. The unexplained death of the jeweler had confirmed his long-standing conviction that an important documentary was waiting to be made about life in the high-rise, perhaps taking the jeweler's death as its starting point. It was a lucky coincidence that he lived in the same block as the dead man. The program would have all the impact of a personal biography. When the police investigation ended, the case would move on to the courts, and a huge question mark of notoriety would remain immovably in place over what he liked to term this high-priced tenement, this hanging palace, self-seeding its intrigues and destruction. Carrying the luggage in his strong arms, Wilder set off on the long walk back to the apartment building. His own apartment was directly above the proscenium of the main entrance. He waited for Helen to emerge onto the balcony and wave him in, one of the few compensations for having to leave his car at the edge of the parking lot. However, all but one of the blinds was still drawn. Quickening his step, Wilder approached the inner lines of parked cars. Abruptly, the illusion of normalcy began to give way. The cars in the front three ranks were spattered with debris, their once bright bodywork streaked and stained. The pathways around the building were littered with bottles, cans, and broken glass, heaped about as if they were being continuously shed from the balconies. In the main entrance, Wilder found that two of the elevators were out of order. The lobby was deserted and silent, as if the entire high-rise had been abandoned. The manager's office was closed, and unsorted mail lay on the tiled floors by the glass doors. On the wall facing the line of elevators was scrawled a partly obliterated message, the first in a series of slogans and private signals that would one day cover every exposed surface in the building. Fittingly enough, these graffiti reflected the intelligence and education of the tenants. Despite their wit and imagination, these complex acrostics, palindromes, and civilized obscenities aerosoled across the walls soon turned into a colorful but indecipherable mess, not unlike the cheap wallpapers found in laundrettes and travel agencies, which the residents of the high-rise most affected to despise. Wilder waited impatiently by the elevators, his temper mounting. Irritably he punched the call buttons, but none of the cars showed any inclination to respond to him. All of them were permanently suspended between the 20th and 30th floors, between which they made short journeys. Picking up his bags, Wilder headed for the staircase. When he reached the second floor, he found the corridor in darkness, and tripped over a plastic sack stuffed with garbage that blocked his front door. As he let himself into the hall, his first impression was that Helen had left the apartment and taken the two boys away with her. The blinds in the living room were lowered, and the air conditioning had been switched off. Children's toys and clothes lay about on the floor. Wilder opened the door of the boys' bedroom. They lay asleep together, breathing unevenly in the stale air. The remains of a meal left from the previous day were on a tray between the beds. Wilder crossed the living room to his own bedroom. One blind had been raised, and the daylight crossed the white walls in an undisturbed bar. Uncannily, it reminded Wilder of a cell he had filmed 2 days earlier in the psychiatric wing of the prison. Helen lay fully dressed on the neatly made bed. He assumed that she was asleep, but as he crossed the room, trying to quieten his heavy tread, her eyes watched him without expression.
"Richard, it's all right,"
she spoke calmly.
"I've been awake. Since you rang yesterday, in fact. Was it a good trip?"
She started to get up, but Wilder held her head on the pillow.
"The boys? What's going on here?"
"Nothing."
She touched his hand, giving him a reassuring smile.
"They wanted to sleep, so I let them. There isn't anything else for them to do. It's too noisy at night. I'm sorry the place is in such a mess."
"Never mind the mess. Why aren't the boys at school?"
"It's closed. They haven't been since you left."
"Why not?"
Irritated by his wife's passivity, Wilder began to knead his heavy hands together.
"Helen, you can't lie here like this all day. What about the roof garden? Or the swimming pool?"
"I think they only exist in my head. It's too difficult."
She pointed to the cinecamera on the floor between Wilder's feet.
"What's that for?"
"I may shoot some footage for the high-rise project."
"Another prison documentary?"
Helen smiled at Wilder without any show of humor.
"I can tell you where to start."
Wilder took her face in his hands. He felt the slim bones, as if making sure that this tenuous armature still existed. Somehow he would raise her spirits. 7 years earlier, when he had met her while working for one of the commercial television companies, she had been a bright and self-confident producer's assistant, more than a match for Wilder, with a quick tongue. The time not spent in bed together they had spent arguing. Now, after the combination of the two boys and a year in the high-rise, she was withdrawing into herself, obsessively wrapped up with the children's most elementary activities. Even her reviewing of children's books was part of the same retreat. Wilder brought her a glass of the sweet liqueur she liked. Trying to decide what best to do, he rubbed the muscles of his chest. What had at first pleased Wilder, but now disturbed him most of all, was that she no longer noticed his affairs with the bachelor women in the high-rise. Even if she saw her husband talking to one of them, Helen would approach, tugging the boys after her, as if no longer concerned with what his wayward sex might be up to. Several of these young women, like the television actress whose Afghan he had drowned in the pool during the blackout, or the continuity girl on the floor above them, had become Helen's friends. The latter, a serious-minded girl who read Byron in the supermarket queues, worked for an independent producer of pornographic films, or so Helen informed him matter-of-factly.
"She has to note the precise sexual position between takes. An interesting job. I wonder what the qualifications are. Or the life expectancy."
Wilder had been shocked by this. Vaguely prudish, he had never been able to question the continuity girl. When they made love in her third-floor apartment, he had the uneasy feeling that she was automatically memorizing every embrace and copulatory posture in case he was suddenly called away, and might take off again from exactly the same point with another boyfriend. The limitless professional expertise of the high-rise had its unsettling aspects. Wilder watched his wife sip the liqueur. He stroked her small thighs in an attempt to revive her.
"Helen, come on. You look as if you're waiting for the end. We'll straighten everything and take the boys up to the swimming pool."
Helen shook her head.
"There's too much hostility. It's always been there, but now it stands out. People pick on the children,
without realizing it, I sometimes think." She sat on the edge of the bed while Wilder changed, staring through the windows at the line of high-rises receding across the sky.
"In fact, it's not really the other residents. It's the building."
"I know, but once the police investigation is over, you'll find that everything will quiet down. For one thing, there'll be an overpowering sense of guilt."
"What are they investigating?"
"The death, of course, of our high-diving jeweler."
Picking up the cinecamera, Wilder took off the lens shroud.
"Have you spoken to the police?"
"I don't know. I've been avoiding everyone."
Brightening herself by an effort of will, she went over to Wilder.
"Have you ever thought of selling the apartment?" We could actually leave. I'm serious.
Helen. Nonplussed for a moment, Wilder stared down at the small, determined figure of his wife. He took off his trousers, as if exposing his thick chest and heavy loins in some way reasserted his authority over himself. That's equivalent to being driven out. Anyway, we'd never get back what we paid for the apartment. He waited until Helen lowered her head and turned away to the bed. At her insistence, 6 months earlier, they had already moved from their first apartment on the ground floor. At the time they had seriously discussed leaving the high-rise altogether, but Wilder had persuaded Helen to stay on, for reasons he had never fully understood. Above all, he would not admit his failure to deal on equal terms with his professional neighbors, to outstare these self-satisfied cost accountants and marketing managers. As his sons wandered sleepily into the room, Helen remarked,
"Perhaps we could move to a higher floor."
Shaving his chin, Wilder pondered this last comment of his wife's. The frail plea had a particular significance, as if some long-standing ambition had been tapped inside his head. Helen, of course, was thinking in terms of social advancement, of moving, in effect, to a better neighborhood, away from this lower-class suburb to those smarter residential districts somewhere between the 15th and 30th floors, where the corridors were clean and the children would not have to play in the street, where tolerance and sophistication civilized the air. Wilder had something different in mind. As he listened to Helen's quiet voice, murmuring to her two sons as if speaking to them from inside a deep dream, he examined himself in the mirror. Like a prize-fighter reassuring himself before a match, he patted the muscles of his stomach and shoulders. In the mental as well as physical sense, he was almost certainly the strongest man in the building, and Helen's lack of spirit annoyed him. He realized that he had no real means of coping with this kind of passivity. His response to it was still framed by his upbringing, by an over-emotional mother who had loved him devotedly through the longest possible childhood she could arrange, and thereby given Wilder what he always thought of as his unshakable self-confidence. She had separated from Wilder's father, a shadowy figure of disreputable background, when he was a small child. The second marriage, to a pleasant but passive accountant and chess enthusiast, had been wholly dominated by the relationship between the mother and her bullock-like son. When he met his future wife, Wilder naively believed that he wanted to pass on these advantages to Helen, to look after her, and provide an endless flow of security and good humor. Of course, as he realized now, no one ever changed, and for all his abundant self-confidence, he needed to be looked after just as much as ever. Once or twice, in unguarded moments during the early days of their marriage, he had attempted to play the childish games he had enjoyed with his mother, but Helen had not been able to bring herself to treat Wilder like her son. For her part, Wilder guessed, love and care were the last things she really wanted. Perhaps the breakdown of life in the high-rise would fulfill her unconscious expectations more than she realized. As he massaged his cheeks, Wilder listened to the air humming erratically in the air-conditioning flues behind the shower stall, pumped all the way down from the roof of the building 39 floors above. He watched the water emerge from the tap. This, too, had made its long descent from the reservoirs on the roof, running down the immense internal wells riven through the apartment block, like icy streams percolating through a subterranean cavern. His determination to make the documentary had a strong personal bias, part of a calculated attempt to come to terms with the building, meet the physical challenge it presented to him, and then dominate it. Dominate it. Dominate it. Dominate it.